Thank you for listening to The New Evil by Dr. Gary Brucato. Please subscribe to his YouTube channel and get the book. With a recently acquired mistress, he gave the gun to a brother, whose conscience later compelled him to inform the police about what Charles had done. The scheming killer then took his own life by leaping into Boston's appropriately named Charles River. A few years ago, another highly narcissistic and unscrupulous man, Justin Barber, had gotten into heavy debt and was envious of his more successful wife, April. He had also begun an affair. He hatched a plot consisting of celebrating their third anniversary by night on a Florida beach. After dinner, he shot April to death with a single bullet before shooting himself superficially in 4 different places, unlikely to prove fatal. He then limped to the police and blamed the attack on a manufactured Mexican man who robbed them before firing shots, explaining that it was dark on the beach and he was unable to describe the assailant any further. It did not escape the attention of the detectives that he had very recently taken out $2 million insurance policies on each of them. 106. It is not clear whether Barber was aware of the Marshall and Stewart cases or he devised his plot all on his own. Each case involved a kind of stupid brilliance, akin to the stupidly brilliant scheme of Joan Shannon on the part of grandiose and malign egotists, each convinced of having outsmarted the best minds of forensic science. The brilliance is, of course, only in the mind of the perpetrator. In reality, these perpetrators are merely cunning, and in addition, conning, since the personality aberration behind these murders is that of the psychopathic con artist with an unshakable belief in his or her superiority and, vis-a-vis the law, untouchability. I think it is fair to say that the very assumption one can devise a foolproof plan will ultimately backfire, proving one was a fool. There are too many details to control. Barber failed to consider how unlikely it was that the non-existent robber could kill April with 1 shot and fail to kill him with 4. Joan Shannon did not grasp that the made-up intruder, had he broken into her home that rainy night, would have left footmarks inside and outside the house. She knew she needed to cry when the police told her about the murder of her husband, and tried hard to think of something to cry about, but she couldn't make a convincing go of it, so she gave herself away. The wife killers were all also blithely unaware of the statistics of uxoricide. The scenario of a murdered wife and live husband points to the male partner as the culprit, wherever he may have been at the time, in over 90% of cases before the detectives and crime scene investigation people even get down to work. Still, my favorite vignette in this area is that of a murder manqué, an uxoricide that didn't happen. It concerns a wealthy physician I saw in consultation, who was furious that, in the wake of an acrimonious divorce and custody battle, his ex-wife came away both with the children and the large home they had all once occupied. He wanted to kill her. To that end, he elaborated a plan of unprecedented subtlety, uncomplicated by the usual ulterior motives of a mistress or an insurance policy that might arouse suspicion. He had an elderly friend who was dying of cancer. He could persuade the man to shoot his wife, then quietly succumb to his illness shortly afterward. This was the clever part. He was unfazed by the aforementioned dictum murdered wife, live husband equals guilty husband. What did give him pause was my reminding him that the dying man was indeed a friend of the family. He had no animus toward the wife, hence no motive. The man's Rolodex, his address book, would contain the names of the husband and wife, but this would point to an obvious connection to the husband, no matter where the husband was at the time. That was the stupid part. He was finally dissuaded and did not pursue his plan further. The husband did not have psychopathic traits like Ed Post or Justin Barber. He was instead an arrogant and contemptuous narcissist, entitled, in his mind, to the life and death powers of a medieval king. He merited his niche in the new narcissism and the new evil. Nothing like his plan existed before the 1960s, or perhaps ever. Intimate partner murders by females. We turn now to rarer spousal or intimate partner murders committed by women. The motives behind these crimes differ in their frequencies, though not in their underlying types, from those perpetrated by men. Men are more often prompted by jealousy, wish to be with a mistress, need to preserve social image, or, less often, greed, as in cases involving insurance money. Greed of this type is somewhat more common among women who kill their male partners, seen in 37% of 69 cases I reviewed. Among 139 males who committed uxoricide, 29.5% were thus motivated. Moreover, women were more often inclined to hire a hitman or to solicit help from a friend or relative to carry out the murder than were men, 33% against 21.5% in my series. Most women have less in the way of physical strength than their husbands or mates. This predisposes, in cases of murder, to more subtle and often less easily detected means, such as poisoning. This appears to have been the weapon used by the independently wealthy Florence Bravo in killing her abusive husband, Charles Bravo, in 1876, namely, a glass of antimony containing tartar emetic .107. Florence displayed some narcissistic traits. She was spoiled and willful, and not at all the picture of wifely subservience that prevailed in Victorian England. Charles, a hopeless alcoholic, was, in all fairness, abusive, insensitive, and cruel, and with divorce so unthinkable in that era, the case comes close to a justified homicide. Florence's spiritual sisters in the new era, nearly a century later, women who have resorted to poisoning their spouses, are often more narcissistic than she, and, in many instances, more imaginative in the poisons they selected. In 1998, for example, Kimberly Herico, a surgical technician, having embarked upon an affair with another man, killed her husband on Valentine's Day with a curariform drug she had taken from the hospital medication cart .108. She tried to cover up the crime by staging a fire as if from her husband's cigar while he was asleep, only there was no soot in his lungs at autopsy, as would be expected in a fire death. Another instance of cunning, foiled by stupidity. She had also hoped to profit from his insurance policy. A few years later, Michelle Michael, a nurse practitioner, killed her husband with rocuronium she had swiped from the nurse's wagon, another curare-like drug .109. She, too, decided to cover up the murder by setting fire to the bedroom where she had killed her husband. She left a laundry iron turned on, but it failed to work, so she returned and added an accelerant. The ensuing fire charred the body, but her husband's liver and heart were intact enough to show the presence of the rocuronium. It would be interesting to know whether these women took their inspiration from a well-known uxoricide in our fulcrum year of 1965, when 34-year-old anesthesiologist Carl Coppolino killed his 32-year-old wife, Dr. Carmela Musetto, with succinylcholine .110. His fortunes waning at the time, he was now free to marry a wealthy divorcee, Mary Gibson. Succinylcholine is a nicotinic acetylcholine receptor agonist, causing muscle relaxation, similar to curare-like drugs, and is difficult to detect post-mortem. Yet science had advanced. Dr. Milton Halpern, New York City's chief medical examiner, and Dr. Joseph Umberger, chief toxicologist, were able to detect the drug in Carmela's brain and liver. This led to Coppolino's conviction and sentencing. Another husband murder using an exotic drug was that committed by Kristen Rossum in November of 2000.111. Kristen came from a distinguished family. A former child model, she had blossomed into a beautiful woman and was also a ballerina until a foot injury ended her dancing career. She became depressed and addicted to methamphetamine, yet was able to graduate college summa cum laude with a major in chemistry. Still in her early 20s, she married and found work in a toxicology lab headed by Michael Robertson. After she and Robertson began an affair, she killed her husband, Greg DeVillers, with an injection of fentanyl, a powerful synthetic opioid. Kristen staged the murder scene to look as though Greg had committed suicide, and even scattered rose petals on the bed, in imitation of the 1999 movie American Beauty. Greg had discovered both the affair and Kristen's ongoing methamphetamine addiction and threatened to expose her. This appeared to be the precipitant to the murder, for which she was sentenced to life in California's Chowchilla prison. As for other women who killed with a poison, some resorted to the tried-and-true arsenic, discovered in 1250 by the famous scholar Albertus Magnus, and used by many men and women ever since for its lethal potential. perhaps most notably by Cesare Borgia. Chemists learned to detect it in the body in the 1830s, so in recent times, arsenic, as a now readily detectable agent, is used less often in spousal murders. More novel compounds have been relied upon instead, as in the 2007 case of Julia Lynn Turner, a Georgia woman married to a policeman but having an affair with a fireman. 112. She ended up killing both men, her husband in 1995 and her boyfriend in 2001, with ethylene glycol, commonly called antifreeze. It was not detected at first, but after the murder of the fireman, calcium oxalate crystals were found in his kidneys, which ruled out the supposed heart attack and ruled in the actual toxin. A woman of extravagant tastes, she killed both men for insurance policies, but had earlier forced her husband to work 3 jobs to pay for various expensive items, many of which were gifts for the fireman. In September of 2004, James Keown, a former radio reporter, killed his wife, Julie, also employing antifreeze, in hopes of settling his debts with her $250,000 insurance policy. 113. It is not clear whether Keown was inspired by the Turner case. Called an evil human being by a judge who sentenced him to life in prison, Keown had lost his job, the source of his debt problem, when his employer discovered he had lied about having been accepted to Harvard Business School. Then Keown lied again, claiming his wife had committed suicide a month after learning she had a fatal kidney condition. She did actually have a kidney condition, but it was induced by the antifreeze he had begun giving her. The clincher came at trial when a computer expert testified that Keown had done an internet search with the terms ethylene glycol death human. More recently, Diane Stout and her daughter Rachel were convicted of killing first Diane's husband Mark in April of 2012 and then her 26-year-old son Sean 5 months later, both with antifreeze. 114. Another daughter, Sarah, 27 years of age, was also poisoned but survived with brain damage. No ulterior motives here. Diane simply hated her 61-year-old husband, as well as her son, because he was worse than a pest. She was frustrated that Sarah was not working at the time. It does seem odd that Diane had the knowledge that antifreeze had recently joined the ranks of foolproof poisons, but also the naivete not to know that its presence had, indeed, been detected in a number of cases over the past 2 decades. Spousal dismemberment and disappearance. In the domain of spousal or intimate partner murder, a feature of the new evil seldom encountered earlier is the effort of a husband or a wife to dismember the victim, such that the victim vanishes from the earth. One is reminded of Comrade Stalin's signature phrase, "Niet человека, niet problema." No body, no problem. This type of murder is different from the more ordinary attempt to hide the evidence of a murder by burying the body in a shallow grave somewhere in the woods. Cremation followed by the scattering of ashes would be one method of total disappearance, as seen in the large-scale crimes of Hitler and bin Laden. But there are other means of complete eradication of human remains, noteworthy for their gruesome originality. In the 1986 murder of his wife, airline pilot Richard Crafts reacted to his wife Hella's discovery of his extramarital affairs, as well as to her request for a divorce, by killing her and then dismembering her corpse, chilling the pieces in a deep freezer to render them easier to pulverize with a rented wood chipper. 115. Suspicions arose, despite his claim that Hella was visiting friends in the Canary Islands and a search was made of a lake near the Connecticut River. No body was found, of course, but a few ounces of remains were collected: a tooth, a toenail, some hairs, fingernails, and type O blood. A forensic odontologist was able to determine that the tooth had belonged to Crafts's wife. The killer was sentenced to 50 years in prison, the first successful prosecution of a murder in Connecticut in which no body was ever found. In 2004, Melanie McGuire, a nurse in a New Jersey fertility clinic, began an affair with a doctor colleague. 116. This went on for some 3 years, and both wanted to divorce their spouses and marry each other. This led to a crisis when Bill, Melanie's husband, wanted to move to Virginia. Solution: Melanie rendered him unconscious with a Mickey, an alcoholic drink laced with a hypnotic, chloral hydrate, and then shot him with a newly purchased pistol. Next, she trisected his body with a chainsaw and then stuffed the pieces into 3 suitcases, which she dumped into the Chesapeake Bay, 200 miles away. Problem: she had placed 5-pound weights in each suitcase, not realizing that much greater weights would be necessary to offset the buoyancy of the gases released by the decomposing body parts. The suitcases surfaced, and the contents were identified as the remains of Bill McGuire. Melanie was duly arrested and sentenced to life in prison. In October of 2009, Dawn Viennes, the wife of Lomita, California chef David Viennes, disappeared without a trace. 117. At first, David told the authorities that, after he argued with Dawn over her alcohol use, she walked off, needing some time away. As time went on, and Dawn never returned home, David became a suspect. In response, he tried to commit suicide by jumping off a cliff but survived. The truth then came out. David thought she was stealing money from the cash register and harming his business. As he told an acquaintance, "That bitch is stealing from me. Nobody steals from me. I will kill that bitch," which he did. The chef then slow-cooked his wife's body in a 55-gallon drum for 4 days, till nothing remained except the skull and jawbone, which he said he hid for safekeeping in his mother's attic. When the police searched the attic, even those parts were not found. Maricopa County, Arizona is the site of not 1 but 2 cases of dismemberment in which women were implicated. In September of 2004, a many times married 43-year-old exotic dancer, Marjorie Orban, killed and dismembered her 7th husband, Jay Orban, ostensibly to inherit his money and to free herself for an 8th marriage to Larry Weisberg. 118. Having shot Jay on his 45th birthday, Marjorie proceeded to cut his body into pieces with a jigsaw. She acid-washed the floor of the garage where all of this transpired and coated it with epoxy, making it impossible to search for traces of blood. She was then caught on videotape, buying 2 large plastic containers at a hardware store, into which she would later pack her husband's dismembered body. Marjorie craved the glamorous life, affiliating with one wealthy man after the other. After the remains were discovered, she was arrested before her perfect crime could be consummated. Avaricious and scheming and lacking remorse, Marjorie is now serving a life sentence. The other Maricopa County case took place nearly 3/4 of a century earlier. Winnie Ruth Judd, 26 at the time, was working at a medical clinic in Phoenix, while her husband was relocating his medical practice to Los Angeles. 119. Ruth became friends with 2 female co-workers. All 3, it seemed, became enamored of John Halloran, a local businessman. Ruth, so it was said, shot the other 2 women to death, and then, with an accomplice, dismembered the bodies, placing the various parts in large shipping trunks and some of the smaller pieces in a valise and hat box. She then traveled by train to Los Angeles, the trunks and boxes all aboard. It is not clear how she hoped to dispose of all of this material, but the crime was given away by the foul odor and fluids escaping from the trunks. Convicted initially of first-degree murder, Ruth was sentenced to be hanged, but at a subsequent hearing she was declared mentally incompetent and remanded to an asylum. As the years passed, new evidence suggested she may have acted in self-defense, or was perhaps even innocent. The famous attorney Melvin Belli, mentioned in our earlier discussion of the Zodiac Killer, took up her cause in 1969, and, 2 years later, the governor of Arizona declared her a free and sane woman. She spent many of her years thereafter serving as a maid in a church, where she was welcomed as a sweet and caring woman, even when someone later recognized her as the Ruth Judd. She lived on quietly as Sister Ruth, dying at age 93. Whatever her role may have been in the crime, narcissistic traits do not appear to have been a significant part of her personality makeup, noteworthy in that these were pre-New Evil crimes. The vastness of the ocean seems more suited, perhaps ideally, to the disappearance of a body compared with the more hazardous earthbound alternatives. Still, caution is required. Unless the abdomen is cut open, gases generated post-mortem will cause the body to rise, if not very heavily weighted down. Also, even if the body is never found, circumstantial evidence may be so compelling as to warrant arrest and even to justify conviction for murder. Illustrative of these points is the notorious case of Scott Peterson. 120. On Christmas Eve in 2002, Scott killed his 8-month pregnant wife, Lacey, and transported her to the San Francisco Bay. There, he dumped her body in the Pacific at a time when his prior internet research on tides assured him her body would be washed out into the ocean, far away from the prying eyes of the authorities. 1 month before the murder, Scott had begun an affair with a young woman, Amber Frey, telling her he was not married, and later telling her he had lost Lacey days before anyone knew she was missing. Considered by some a pathological liar and white-collar psychopath, i.e., he had a good job and no history of prior arrests or juvenile delinquency, he told Amber, after Lacey had gone missing, that he was in Paris at a business meeting when he was instead by the bay, checking out the tides. To Amber's question about the water she thought she could hear in the background, he explained adroitly that the business meeting was taking place near the Seine, and so on. By this time, nearly a month after Lacey's disappearance, the police had accumulated enough evidence, partly through Amber's cooperation in recording all of her conversations with him, to arrest him, even in the absence of a body. Actually, 2 bodies, those of his wife and her unborn baby boy. Then, Scott's tide calculations notwithstanding, both bodies washed ashore and could be identified as Lacey and their dead son. Arrested and convicted, Scott is now on San Quentin's death row, which means life in prison without parole, since California no longer carries out the death penalty. We alluded to times that a body was dumped in the ocean and never found, yet a murder conviction resulted, based upon equally compelling circumstantial evidence. Point 121. The Peterson case is, in many ways, a duplicate of Charles Stewart's murder of his pregnant wife. Both were psychopathic men who were romancing mistresses at the time of the murders, but their wishes to marry these new women, unencumbered by divorce and ongoing expenses of childcare, was not the primary motive in either crime. Rather, these murders seemed chiefly motivated by wishes to avoid fatherhood, with all of its responsibilities, financial obligations, and, vis-a-vis extramarital dalliances, limitations. One of the detectives investigating the Peterson case remarked that parenthood was an anchor for Scott. 122, not a stabilizing force, that is, but a heavy, constrictive weight. Stalking, in its root meaning stalking, connotes a stealthy sneaking up as a preparatory step before finally pouncing on the object of one's desire. This is how members of the cat family operate in order to secure their dinners. The same basic notion is conveyed in many other languages as well. Auflauern in German, Tracker in French, Asaker in Spanish, Vishliajivat in Russian, and so forth. In our species, stalking has a long history and can vary in dangerousness from harmless to fatal. The objects of stalking, in any of its many forms, are often persons with special advantages: beauty, wealth, power, exalted social status, fame, and celebrity. In the early days of Queen Victoria's reign, for example, an adolescent known as Boy Jones sneaked several times into the palace to steal some of the Queen's underwear and to sit for a moment on the throne. He meant her no harm, but some remonstrance was in order, so he was sent to Australia. There are several taxonomies in the realm of stalking. Paul Mullen and colleagues distinguish between the rejected stalker, the resentful stalker, the paraphilic stalker, as in cases of voyeurism, pedophilia, fetishism, and telephone scatologia, the predatory stalker, the intimacy seeker, and the incompetent suitor. 124. The rejected type is generally narcissistic, overly dependent, low in self-esteem, and markedly possessive and jealous, as though the love object were the only one in the world. The resentful stalker is one who feels persecuted or otherwise unfairly treated, usually by a boss or by someone else in a superior position, against whom the stalker must fight back, often with insulting phone calls, poison pen letters, or worse. The predatory stalker, almost always male, lies in wait for an assault, usually sexual, meantime gathering information about a victim and rehearsing a plan of attack. An example is the serial killer Dennis Rader. 125. The intimacy seeker aspires to achieve a relationship via unwanted attention, calls, and following a victim. Stalkers in this category are usually lonely and friendless, impervious to the indifference on the part of their love objects, and near delusional in the belief that their pursuits will one day be crowned with success. A variant of the intimacy seeker brand of stalker was described centuries ago under a number of headings. Mélancolie érotique by Jacques Ferrand, 1623. Monomanie érotique by Jean-Étienne Dominique Esquirol, 1838. And erotischer Wahnsinn by Richard von Krafft-Ebing, 1881. Persons of this type are often said to manifest obsessive love. Persons described by Gaëtan de Clérambault, however, are almost all women, often quite disturbed, psychologically, and of lower social status. They are convinced that men of superior status are communicating their love for them through hidden signs and signals. A patient I once worked with, for example, thought that if the professor she admired assigned the class a reading that began with the letter L, it meant he secretly loved her. While many stalkers, apart from the predatory, are harmless, though at times extremely irritating and frustrating, stalking with fatal consequences has become a recurring phenomenon in the era of new evil. Some of the victims have been celebrities, others, persons in ordinary walks of life who, for one reason or another, had taken on special significance in the eyes of their stalkers. Some of these offenders have been grossly psychotic. They tend to be among the most persistent and untreatable. A non-fatal case was that of the schizophrenic woman whom psychiatrist Dr. Doreen Orion once saw in her consulting room. 126. Dr. Orion's mistake was to be her usual kind and sympathetic self when speaking with a patient. Lonely and friendless, the woman took this display of common kindness as a token of the doctor's genuine affection. The patient would silently hover around the doctor's house, peeking in the windows and so forth, with such frequency as to impel the doctor and her husband to move from Arizona to Colorado, where the situation repeated itself once their new address was discovered. Dr. Orion finally took legal action and eventually managed to get some satisfaction from laws related to stalking that had recently been enacted, capable of imposing incarceration for certain periods of time. At the time, the latter was new territory for the courts, since the type of stalking Dr. Orion suffered had not previously led to extended jail sentences. Her patient was erotomanic, a psychotic woman who had been in a psychiatric hospital prior to the consultation with Dr. Orion. Because of the psychotic component, individuals of this type are incapable of grasping how unwanted their attentions are, hence the irremediable persistence. Dr. Orion commented on the more common type of stalker, one who has been in a relationship with the victim and can't let go. These people are extremely narcissistic. They want what they want, and they do not care if the victim does not want the same. 127. In a high-profile case that partook of both erotomania, obsessive love combined with the irrational belief that the love is returned, and the rejected stalker subtype described by Mullen and colleagues, Robert Bardo of Arizona became fixated on the 21-year-old model and television actress Rebecca Schaeffer, the star of the sitcom My Sister Sarah. He had even built a personal shrine to Schaeffer in his home. At one point, she, or her secretary, sent him a signed photo of herself, as stars often do for their fans. The word fan has ominous overtones here. It is a shorthand for fanatic, meaning nothing more than someone enthusiastic about some celebrity. It does not mean crazy, but Bardo was chronically psychotic and took the photo to mean that Schaeffer returned his love. So far so good, but when Bardo happened to see a movie in which Schaeffer acted in a sex scene, he felt betrayed and then determined to kill her. He managed to learn her Los Angeles address via the Department of Motor Vehicles, traveled to LA, knocked on her door, and shot her to death. Arrested soon after, Bardo is now serving a life sentence. His pattern of celebrity stalking was established well before his fixation on Schaeffer. He had previous obsessional loves toward Madonna, Tiffany, and other stars. In prison, he has been a prolific artist, creating meticulously drawn close-up portraits of beautiful movie actresses. The killer's behavior satisfied the legal definition of stalking, someone who willfully, maliciously, and repeatedly follows or harasses someone, making a credible threat to that person's safety. California and other states put stronger anti-stalking laws into effect after the Bardo case. Among other improvements, it is no longer possible to obtain someone's address through the DMV. Had it not been for the high-profile nature of the murder, Bardo, who had been hospitalized psychiatrically twice before, would probably have been remanded to a forensic hospital. When I corresponded and spoke with him several years ago, his responses from prison, 15 years after the 1989 murder, were clearly irrational and bizarre, well in keeping with a schizophrenic psychosis. The 1969 case of Prosenjit Potter had also become high-profile, not because a celebrity had been killed, but because of a failure on the part of the psychiatric profession to warn a person of imminent danger. 129. Potter, born in India, was a student at the University of California, Berkeley. He had attended folk dancing classes at International House, where he met Tatiana Tarasov. At a New Year's Eve party held there in 1968, she kissed him. Potter interpreted this innocent gesture in a much more serious way, along the lines of the culture of his Dalit, untouchable social caste, in which such a kiss would betoken a serious relationship or even an engagement. She did not return such feelings and made this known to Potter, who then felt intense resentment and began stalking her. While she visited Brazil the next summer, Potter, in a state of depression and rage, saw a campus psychologist and spoke of wanting to kill Tarasov. The psychologist, diagnosing paranoid schizophrenia, recommended civil commitment, but a psychiatrist who interviewed Potter later decided the man was rational. Several months after Tarasov's return, in October of 1969, Potter shot and stabbed her to death. This led to the decision by the California Supreme Court that a mental health professional has a duty to warn individuals who are specifically threatened by a patient. The issue is still debated. Most states have adopted this opinion, but not all. In comparison to spousal murderers, kidnappers, serial killers, and the like, stalkers are much more likely to show signs of mental illness, if not frank psychosis. The reader is reminded of our vignette about stalker and murderer Mark David Chapman earlier in this volume, in which we discussed his killing of John Lennon in 1980. Before his trial, over a dozen psychiatrists evaluated Chapman, at least 6 concluding that he was psychotic, with most favoring a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. Some argued, in an odd twist of language, that his delusion fell short of psychosis. He was sentenced to prison, where he remains to this day, though, as with Bardo, absent the publicity from killing so famous a person, Chapman might have been sent indefinitely to a forensic hospital. A more florid example of mental illness in a stalker is that of Arthur Jackson, a schizophrenic man from Aberdeen, Scotland. 130. In one of the earliest of the violent incidents of celebrity stalking, Jackson had become obsessed with the actress Teresa Saldana, whom he had seen in the 1980 movie, Defiance. This was not erotomania, since he did not harbor the delusion that she loved him. Instead, he had the delusion that, if he killed her and was then executed for the murder, he considered suicide a sin. He could join her eternally in heaven. One can only stand in awe at the powers of madness that Jackson found no trouble in imagining, that, as Saldana's murderer, he, too, would go to heaven rather than the other place, and that she would welcome his eternal companionship. To fulfill his ambition, at all events, he sneaked into the United States illegally and made his way to Los Angeles. There, he tracked her down, obtaining her address, and encountered her on the morning of March 15, 1982. He stabbed her numerous times, but she was rescued when a passerby heard her screams and pulled Jackson away. After his arrest, Jackson was placed in the Atascadero Forensic Hospital and was later sent to a psychiatric hospital in England, where he died in 2004 at the age of 68. One might speculate that his efforts to find out where Saldana lived inspired Robert Bardo to track down Rebecca Schaeffer's whereabouts 7 years later, but this is not known for certain. We have dwelled thus far mainly on stalkers who targeted well-known people. Stalking is hardly confined to the famous. Estimates in the United States point to how 1 woman in 12 reports having been stalked at some point in her life, as opposed to only 1 man in 45. As to the risk of having been victimized in the previous year, stalking, at 1%, occupies an intermediate position between rape, 0.3%, and physical assault, 1.9%. Erotomanic forms of stalking are common in the larger group, though there are, as hinted at above, important differences in how the disorders manifest themselves. As Dr. J. Reed Malloy points out, the classic declarum beau type, those with the conviction of being secretly loved by the object of their affections, who may be quite unaware of the erotomanic person's existence, is the less common form. 131 Malloy designates these as exhibiting erotomanic delusional disorder. More common are disorders of obsessive love, in which the person in question does recognize the lack of reciprocity on the part of the love object. Consider the case of John Hinckley Jr., who tried to kill President Reagan in 1981. He knew very well that his inamorata, the actress Jodie Foster, far from returning his love, had no interest in him whatsoever and, when they were both at Yale, regarded him as quite rude for slipping love letters and poems under her door. Hinckley imagined that in killing the president, he would elevate himself to her level of fame, becoming somehow worthy of her affection. Just before the shooting, Hinckley tried to convey his sense of urgency in a letter to the star, never mailed, in which he said, "I will admit to you that the reason I'm going ahead with this attempt now is because I cannot wait any longer to impress you. I've got to do something now to make you understand in no uncertain terms that I am doing all of this for your sake." 132 Malloy calls this type of fixation borderline erotomania. This is also where one might categorize Richard Farley, whose fixation upon Laura Black and murderous rampage at her place of employment we have already reviewed. Farley, by the way, is not the only stalker who also committed a mass murder. In 1983, Michael Perry, a schizophrenic man who stalked actress Olivia Newton-John in California, failed in his plan to find and harm her. He returned to his home in Louisiana and killed his entire family. At the time of his arrest, he was also planning to kill Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. 133. Darnell Collins, an ex-con who had been stalking his ex-girlfriend April Gates, shot and killed her, her mother, and 5 others after Gates attained an order of protection against him. 134. The Collins case differed from the more typical erotomanic types in that she had actually been his girlfriend, whereas Newton-John knew nothing of Perry's existence. Rebecca Schaefer was likely not aware her staff had ever sent Bardo her picture, and Jodie Foster knew of Hinckley only as a... The Collins case was less newsworthy but more ordinary. The majority of stalkers have had at least some acquaintance with their victims. Persons in the grip of this kind of obsessive love need not be psychotic, although Arthur Jackson was. Bardo occupies an intermediate position, to my way of thinking, insofar as he felt that the photo of Schaefer that she sent him, on which she scribbled, "Love you," perhaps signified that she did love him a little. That is to say, he completely misread a meaningless thing, but he did not start out with the conviction that she was secretly in love with him. He was not thoroughly delusional in relation to her, although he was unmistakably schizophrenic in general, as was Jackson, who, again, was aware Saldana did not love him. As to the personality attributes seen with frequency in erotomanic persons, especially borderline erotomanics, uppermost are the narcissistic, with an emphasis on entitlement, the paranoid, and often the antisocial and schizoid, in the sense of socially aloof and awkward traits. The ability to engage in these sorts of behaviors has been amplified by the internet, which has facilitated stalking at a distance, and also given a kind of false encouragement to would-be stalkers via the ease with which one can create fictitious names for oneself when contacting potential victims. This cyberstalking has currently become a priority for the FBI and represents a new variety of crime, another new evil of the present era. The narcissistic element is fortified, in great measure, via the anonymity behind which the stalker can hide when reaching out to other people, even in locales far removed from the stalker, geographic proximity no longer being a necessity. Cyberstalking is ordinarily a non-lethal form of stalking, except in the cases mentioned above under bullying, though nonetheless potentially highly disturbing and threatening. Some recent examples. Joseph Ostrowski, a 29-year-old head football coach in a Pennsylvania high school, used social networking sites in order to harass, threaten, and intimidate a number of female students at the University of Michigan. 135. He had been exploiting personal information his victims had posted online. In addition, he was found to have child pornography stored in his computer. In 2013, Ostrowski was sentenced to 30 years in prison for the two offenses. A Detroit man, James Allen, was arrested on charges of cyberstalking at least 10 women in the Buffalo area, threatening them with the comment, "Communicate with me, or I'll send nude pictures of you to your friends and family." 136. He was arrested on felony charges of cyberstalking, trafficking in computer passwords, and making harassing telephone calls. Allen went so far as to create fake Facebook profiles and to pose as a site administrator, asking the women to contact him via their webcams. In a final example, in 2014, a 22-year-old New York political activist, Adam Savader, was sentenced to 30 months in prison for extortion and stalking. 137. He hacked into the online accounts of 15 women and found nude photos of them. The intimidating aspect was in his warning his victims, "Let's make this simple. You have until noon. I am not bluffing. Don't be stupid. Once I send pics of you, they cannot be unsent." He apparently suffered from mental health problems of some sort, as even the court agreed, but as Judge Marianne Batani wisely added, "You can't use mental illness as an excuse, as long as you know right from wrong." As for these 3 cases of cyberstalking, I would not have been able to learn of them were it not for the internet, so it has its upside as well. No discussion of stalking, particularly of the borderline erotomanic sort, can be considered complete without reference to the phenomenal case of Diane Schaefer and her deliberate intrusion into the life of Dr. Murray Brennan, a world-renowned cancer specialist in New York City. 138. People who have suffered through a particularly dreadful marriage or an ego-crunching work situation are often wont to describe their plights as having lived through a bad movie. In the case of Schaefer and Dr. Brennan, a movie actually was fashioned after his 8-year ordeal with Schaefer. The 2002 film called Obsession was quite good, the story behind it anything but. There are, to be sure, obsessive elements in any case of stalking. There are the repetitive, driven behaviors, which a victim is powerless to control and stop. Alongside these are preoccupations and fixations that gobble up one's mental activities throughout the waking day. One's dreams may carry these concerns on into the night. Yet by, quote, obsessive love, we are usually referring to one of 2 main situations. In the first scenario, one has a serious crush on a man or a woman whom one knows but has not dated, merely admiring the person from a distance. In Goethe's story, Werther, mentioned earlier, and perhaps based on Goethe's own youthful and temporary obsession with Charlotte Buff, Werther knew and loved his friend Lotte, though there was no intimacy. He remained obsessed with her after she married her fiancé, Albert, even committing suicide so as not to interfere with her life with her husband. A man of scruples, in other words, who would never harm the person he loved, albeit obsessively. In the other situation, one has had a real and often intimate relationship with someone, and then, after a breakup, becomes obsessed with this former lover. Everyone knows such a person, and many a play and opera has such a story as its theme. In La Bohème, the hero, Rodolfo, falls in love with the beautiful Mimi in Act 1, and then, in Act 3, becomes obsessed and morbidly jealous to the point of forcing her to leave him. Of this type, there are those with scruples, and then there are those obsessed not only with the former lover, but also with revenge and the desire to harm the individual. Diane Schaefer, in contrast, does not fit easily into these schemata. She was engulfed in an obsessive love for a man with whom she had no connection, unlike Werther and Lotte, and knew only by reputation. Thank you for listening to The New Evil by Dr. Gary Brucato. Please tune in next week for future Audible readings. Like, subscribe, and share on 12-Gauge Investigative and Dr. Gary Brucato's page. See you later. Watch your 6.